make a rosemary olive oil cake. There's a couple reasons why I chose to make this recipe. One is that most cakes that are made with a solid fat, which means it's higher in saturated fat, it's less heart healthy. This one replaces all of that with olive oil. Having oil in a cake actually makes it like moister, softer. I actually think they have better texture when they're made with liquid oils than solid oils, so you get a few benefits there. There's actually enough oil in the cake that it's not going to stick to your pan, but I do want to show you a trick just for when you're making other cakes, since this is a nice place to show you in the curriculum. So I'm going to coat the bottom of my pan with parchment, and so a nice way to get the circle the size you want is to set your pan on a piece of parchment paper, and then just take a pen and draw a circle around, like like you're a kid and you're tracing your hand, but doing it with a cake pan. Just gotta hold it down with your hand so it doesn't move. All right, and then you just have to remember to cut a little bit inside the line because, of course, you're drawing around the outside. So go ahead and cut this. It doesn't have to be perfect. Really don't worry about it too much. Better to have it a little small than a little too big, honestly. If it's too big, it will kind of wrinkle up in the bottom of your pan and might give the top of your cake an irregular appearance. So people are always asking ways to get things not to stick to pans. So parchment is usually a fail-safe. And then you can spray the bottom of your pan and then stick that on. The other thing that you can do is I'm using what's called a springform pan. All that means is that the sides come off the bottom. There's a little hinge there, you can see. So the bottom comes out. So this is, if you have something that you're really worried about sticking, having a springform pan pretty much eliminates any chance of the sides sticking. So again, you really don't need parchment in this recipe, but I just wanted to show you in case you don't have this type of pan at home and you're worried about your cake sticking. To make sure the parchment doesn't slide around when you add your batter, you can just go ahead and put a quick spray of nonstick spray or just wipe it with some oil. And then you just lay your disc of parchment in there. Want to smooth it down. The oil will help it stick a little bit. And then your pan is ready to go. So we'll set this off to the side. The other thing that we did ahead of time is preheat our oven. This is 350 degrees. If you're not sure what temperature to bake your baked goods at, it's usually 350 degrees, although some things are a little bit higher than that. And then similar to when we were making the banana bread recipe, this is going to have less sugar than would be in a traditional cake. And that means we don't want to overmix it, so that's just one thing to keep in mind. This has part all-purpose flour, and then I picked this recipe because it also demonstrates using some other types of flour. So the other flour I have here is spelt flour, and that's it's not a gluten-free grain, but it is lower in gluten. The nice thing about baking with lower gluten flours is that it gives you a finer crumb, so it's just more melt in your mouth. And the other nice thing about spelt flour compared to, say, whole wheat flour, since it is another whole grain flour, is that it has a sweeter taste. So you can get away with having less sugar in your final dish if you're using some spelt flour versus, say, if I used whole wheat flour. But if I couldn't find this and I was using whole wheat flour, it's also okay. It will still be tasty. And I'm going to make the regular version. I'll explain how you could do a vegan variation, one that doesn't have any eggs, in a minute. And that will include modifying the amount of leavening. Leavening is usually baking powder or baking soda. So I'm going to put in my leavening here. If you are making this without any eggs, you would add an additional teaspoon of baking soda. And then you'd also have to add a tablespoon of vinegar to the liquid ingredients. That acid in the vinegar helps to activate the baking soda, causing it to rise when it gets in the oven. Actually, even before it gets to the oven. If you've ever made volcanoes as a kid with baking soda and vinegar, you can get the idea. And then we'll add a little bit of salt to this. And then if you have a whisk handy, you can whisk it. Otherwise, I'll just stir it around with my spatula. Just want to make sure that everything looks a uniform color when you're mixing it. You can also sift it together. So I showed sifting in one of the earlier recipes. It's another way to make sure there's no clumps. We actually pre-sifted this, so we're not worried about it. All right. So those are our dry ingredients. We'll set those off to the side and work on our wet ingredients. I'm going to crack some eggs in here. If you want to make this egg-free, again, make sure to change the leavening and the vinegar, as I mentioned, and then you could replace this with 3 flax eggs. It would be 3 tablespoons of ground flaxseed with enough water to make it 4.5 ounces total when it's mixed together, and you want to use warm water for that. All right, then I'm going to add my sugar, some white sugar here. I'm going to start whisking now just because my bowl is a little bit smaller and I really want to get that sugar well incorporated. So I'm going to whisk it in to the eggs until it looks like it's starting to dissolve. It also gets really messy once you add the olive oil. It can start sloshing, splashing. You get oil splatters on your clothes. Definitely something you want to wear an apron when you're making. And then you can use either whole milk, dairy milk, or you can use plant-based milk. I'm using an unsweetened soy milk here. Just trying to show you a variety of ingredients you can use in cooking. I'm gonna make sure to get unsweetened. The sweetened version has a lot of added sugar. And if you don't get the unsweetened kind, or you're using regular dairy milk, you could even get away with reducing the sugar a little bit because dairy milk has naturally occurring sugars called lactose. And then just because I feel like it incorporates it better into the recipe, you can whisk in your chopped up rosemary in here. So I'm actually gonna take a little bit of that out. That's a little bit more than I like. So it can be very strong. So the rosemary has a quite strong taste. What I like about this is it's got a savory component as a dessert. So we're using a dark chocolate that we'll add in a minute. And then the rosemary really marries well with the flavors of the chocolate. It brings out a lot of the complexity that you might not otherwise notice in the chocolate. It also makes it, since this is one of our richer desserts where we're gonna have a smaller portion, maybe with a side of fruit or maybe with a cup of coffee or something, then it's nice to have these strong flavors so you really feel satisfied that you got something interesting, even if you're not having a huge piece. And you can use other herbs as well, anything that you like the taste of with chocolate. Lavender works well, although I wouldn't use quite so much. Basil works well. I really like rosemary, and it's just kind of everywhere where we are in California. You don't even have to buy it. You can just go for a walk and pick it off the curbside somewhere. All right, and we'll whisk in our oil as the last thing here. So we're just using extra virgin olive oil. It's going to have an olive oil flavor, and that's okay. That's another reason to have the strong flavored chocolate, the strong flavored herbs, is that if all the other flavors of this were really subtle, it would just be a really overwhelming olive flavor, which wouldn't be the best type of cake to have olive oil in. Usually when you're doing cakes, if you're going to use an oil, you'd want to use a neutral oil, which would be canola oil or vegetable oil. But here we actually do want the flavor of the olive oil. Now we're going to bring over our dry ingredients and mix that in. So I'm going to pour my wet into my dry purely because my dry ingredient bowl is bigger. Pour that in. All right. And then, like I said earlier, you don't want to over mix it. So I'm actually just going to add the chocolate in now so that once it's mixed, it's ready to go. So I should show you here. So in the chocolate here, there's some bigger pieces, and then toward the bottom, there's actually some little slivers. Maybe not as many as I would usually have. Let's see if I can find them. Yeah, there's the slivers. And it's nice to have a variety of sizes. So the bigger pieces might fall further into the cake, and the smaller pieces will stay, kind of up higher. So, all right. And I'm just folding this together. Again, just scooping up from the bottom, trying to make sure you don't have any of those bits of flour stuck down there. We're getting close, and again, we want to mix it till there's just a few little tiny pieces of flour that aren't mixed in, but most of it is mixed in, and then we know we're ready to go and we haven't overmixed it. Okay, I think we're ready. So I have my pan that's been prepared. I'm just going to pour the batter into it. And if you have to scrape your spatula, I encourage you to scrape it on the bowl and not on your pan, because then you'll get these burned bits on the edge of your baking dish. So, right. I should say the chocolate that I use in here is 70% or greater. You can really get away with using some pretty dark chocolate in this because of the rosemary. And then the other thing you can do, which gives it a really nice crisp texture when you bite into it, is to sprinkle a little bit of sugar on top. So I just have a couple tablespoons of sugar. It'd be really good if you use cinnamon sugar too, although we didn't put any cinnamon in the recipe, so I'm just using regular. It's another thing that you can do to the top of quick bread that makes it have a little bit of extra sweetness, especially if you reduce the sugar in the recipe. It gives the illusion that there's a lot more sugar than there is in it. And then also, again, there's that nice crisp crunch after it comes out of the oven. It gives it almost like a crust. All right. And you really won't see it once it's cooked. It will just be a little bit crispy on top. So this is ready to go in the oven. We'll check it after about 40 minutes, but it will probably take between 40 and 50 minutes. And then we'll test it with a toothpick like we've showed you in the other recipes. And we just want to make sure that a toothpick inserted into the center comes out clean without any liquid attached. If there's some dry crumbs, that's okay. You just don't want liquid batter sticking to the toothpick, and then it's done. It's better to underbake things very, very slightly than to overbake them. But again, if you underbake a lot, then it will be very doughy and not a very pleasant texture. So there will be some carryover cooking. So if it's very done by the time you test it, it's going to get even more done as it sits to cool. You also don't want to try and cut it when it's hot. You'll just get a melty chocolate mess everywhere. It's very delicious that way. But if you want it to look nice and you want a good presentation, you'll want to let it cool all the way before you cut this dessert. So now we have this really beautifully fragrant rosemary olive oil cake with lots of good dark chocolate in there, fresh out of the oven. We're just going to test it, see if it's done. You just have to take a toothpick, insert it into, I recommend a crack so you don't leave a hole, and just check to make sure there's no wet batter on the toothpick. Dry crumbs are okay. And it looks like this is finished. So we did end up cooking it about 50 minutes. And it will sometimes adhere a little bit to the side, so just to make sure we don't rip it apart when we release this spring form, or if you're using just a regular cake pan and you need to just dump it out, you can take a butter knife or anything with a flat edge and just make sure that it's loosened up. When I do that, I'm just kind of pressing down. You can kind of cut away anything that looks like it's sticking, but you can also just, if you're pressing down, you can see if the cake is sticking or if it's moving on its own accord, and it's not sticking at all, actually. You can actually hear that little bit of sugar that I added for the crisping as I go around. So it's, it's gonna give it a really nice texture. If you do have a springform pan, you just kind of pop that open, and then as you push it, it will make the diameter or circumference bigger of the circle of the pan, and then you can make sure it's loose, and then pull it away when you know that the cake isn't stuck at all. Make it a little bit bigger. There we go. And pull it away free. See, that's really nice if you have it, but otherwise, as long as you do a good job loosening the edges from a regular cake pan, it will come out. I'm going to let it cool just a little bit, but then what we'll do is we'll invert it and pull the bottom off, and then let it cool completely on the cooling rack before we slice it.